And I know that you think I'm finished, but actually now I have the great pleasure of introducing Jack Stern, who is, in fact, a distinguished teaching professor in the Department of Anatomical Sciences here at Stony Brook, and was someone that when I was in graduate school I respected a great deal, because you always knew where you stood with Jack. If he was mad at you, he told you. If he wasn't, he also told you that. And so it wasn't like, you know, as a graduate student, you're running around trying to figure out where you are, and everyone's, yeah, they're nice, and you think, well, he doesn't really want to talk to me. If Jack didn't want to talk to you, he told you. So in any case, I admire him a great deal, and I was telling him earlier, I still do a Groucho walk for my students. So without further ado, Jack Stern. Oh, I'm leaving this here.
Well, certainly I want to thank Kay for that nice introduction. Those of you who in any way at all know about my career know that I got out of the fossil interpretation business quite a few years ago. I had to do that because I felt it was leading me to scientific perdition, and I will be glad to explain that comment later if you want to know. When John came and asked me to give this lecture or to talk at this symposium, one thing popped into my mind.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
So, you have a right to ask, why did I agree to do it? And I agreed to do it for only one reason, and that's because John told me, and I know that in a very few minutes he's going to regret this. John told me that this talk could be devoid of serious content. And that was an offer I just simply couldn't refuse. And I'd like to start out, actually, by telling you how I ever got involved in interpreting fossils. When I was a young man, I was not a very good athlete. And at that time, I didn't bear the striking resemblance to Robert Redford that I do today. So I knew that I could not become famous and gain recognition in the field of professional sports or in the movies. And I had to come up with a different way to gain this fame. And I made the decision that I would solve the problems of the origins of human bipedalism. This is my first attempt to do so. This is a monograph based on my dissertation. As far as I'm aware, not a single living soul read this document. I do believe now that it was because the title, Functional Myology of the Hip and Thigh of Cebid Monkeys and Its Implications for the Evolution of Erect Posture, was simply too long and pedantic, and that I would really have been much better to go with my second choice. Well, I didn't get famous writing that dissertation, and so my next attempt actually was to study muscle function in non-human primates, especially those that were particularly good at bipedal behavior. And for those of you who have never seen this, this is a gibbon, and these represent, each one of those squiggly lines represents the electrical activity of the muscles of this gibbon's forelimb as it swings along the cage, all right? This particular experiment didn't have anything to do with the origins of bipedalism, but I have to tell you, I look at this and I'm impressed that we were able to accomplish technologically. This is not an easy thing to do. And we did it, and I couldn't have done it without collaboration of my two colleagues, Bill Jungers, that's Bill right there, and Randy Sussman. They had very specific tasks during all of our electromyographic experiments. Bill's job was to read literature to make sure no one was scooping us. Randy's job was to stare at this tinfoil shield to make sure it didn't come unwrapped from the cable. All right? All of the other aspects of the research I handled myself. All right. Now, as a matter of fact, this research did bring us a measure of recognition. At the 1979 meetings of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists held in San Francisco, there was an entire morning or afternoon session, Bill will remember which, I don't, Bill Kimball, devoted to the presentation of the new finds from the Hadar region of Ethiopia. Now, you would have thought that that was the most newsworthy thing to occur at those 1979 meetings. But in fact, the San Francisco Chronicle chose to run this article about some studies that we had done on the muscle activity of the human gluteus maximus. And I know the reason they chose to run it, because I'd learned my lesson about being too long-winded and pedantic. And when they asked me to summarize what this work was about, I just said, we walked and jumped. And that sold the reporter. It was something he could understand. All right. So we really did achieve some recognition, and I felt I was on my way, but this was very fleeting indeed, as it turned out, because the next year or year and a half, all the press turned their attention to the people who discovered and interpreted Afarensis, and we were forgotten. And so Randy walked into my office one day, and he said, you know, Jack, we really should get involved in what was now developing argument over the locomotor behavior of Australopithecus afarensis. He says, you know, we're smart people. We might be able to figure this out. And so Randy and I went off to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Bill tagged along because he knew that he was as smart as either one of us, and actually thought he was smarter than both of us put together. All right? So we go to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. There we see a lot of casts of Lucy and some original fossils, but not very many original fossils. And Randy said, Jack, we've got to go see these fossils in Ethiopia. Now, Randy knows that I don't like to travel. He also knows that I'm not real strong on geography. So in order to entice me to take this trip, he showed me the following map. You know, it looked easy. You just take a right turn past Southampton, all right? When the limousine started to take us to Kennedy Airport, I was just too embarrassed to back out at that time. So in fact, we did land in Ethiopia. Now, I cannot describe that trip as entirely successful. When we got there, not only were we denied permission to look at any of the fossils, but we were told in no uncertain terms to take the first flight out of that country if we knew what was good for us. And we did. And that flight took us to Nairobi, because on this trip we also had intended to see the fossils at the fossils from Turkana Basin, Olduvai, at the Kenya National Museum. And I tell you, this did not have an auspicious start either. It looked like for a long time I was never going to get any closer to the inside of the Kenya National Museum than this picture. We all recognize Richard's father there. That's because Randy forgot to put my name on the form seeking permission to look at these fossils. All right? So I don't know, I could spend my whole time there in the hotel, I guess. But in fact, I got a last-minute reprieve when the Kenyan government understood that all I really was an assistant to a very famous American scientist. And therefore, they agreed to let me in. And indeed, this proves that I actually have seen a fossil in my life. I actually don't know what this fossil is. I don't want to offend anybody, but if it's not a limb bone, it may as well be a potato as far as I'm concerned. All right. But there are some limb bones here, and those limb bones, in fact, constituted the basis of the first paper that I ever was involved in interpreting a fossil. This is on the OH35 tibiofibia, the OH8 foot, in which Randy and I said that we thought the creature walked just like a modern human. Something that people did not find miraculous, and so also did not bring us any attention. So when we got back to Stony Brook, however, we still were determined to try and interpret the locomotor behavior of afarensis, and I thank Don Johansson, this is him a long time ago, for sending us the cast of everything we asked for. He was very gracious and sent us every piece of material that we asked for. We did our analysis. I'm not going to go through 18 things, but we found numerous traits, some of these are obviously correlated with one another, that we thought indicated that there was an arboreal component of the behavior that was adaptively important for this animal. Three of these are clearly, at least to me, three of these were clearly more important than the others. I mean, I thought that the fact that the proximal phalanges of the fingers were markedly curved, that the proximal phalanges of the feet were markedly curved, and that the glenoid cavity, that's the area where for those of you who are not anatomists, the area where the upper arm bone articulates or makes the joint with the shoulder, faced more superiorly, that is more towards the sky, as if you need to raise your arms to locomote. These were the three most important things in my mind. And just to briefly, these are actual photographs of the actual Ethiopian fossil material, because Randy traveled back to Ethiopia later and looked at the original fossils. And you'll notice how he's cut off the head of this bone because I wasn't there to assist him. All right? But these are the actual the bones of the first parts of your fingers. And we quantified curvature in these specimens. We felt it was very important to, rather than just say, gee, that looks curved, that looks straight, to come up with a measure of it. This measure called included angle, I will not explain to those who don't know about it now, but it was a pretty good method, we thought. And these are all of these bones from the first part of the fingers of the afarensis material, and you can see they pretty much line up with African apes and are much more curved. By the way, this higher the number, the more curved the bone. The lower number, the straighter the bone. They are much more curved than any modern human that we found in our sample. Here are pictures of the actual toe bones, the bones from the first part of the toe from A. afarensis. Here is a chimp bone. Here is a human bone. Clearly, on a purely, obvious or appearance sake, they look a lot more like chimpanzee toe bones than they look like human toe bones. Once again, we quantified the curvature. Once again, this is more curved, this is less curved, and all of the toe bones lined up with African apes and far from humans and far from baboons, which are terrestrial primates as well. So those were two very important pieces of evidence I thought we came up with. Here is a human shoulder blade, a scapula. Here's the surface that I talked about, the glenoid cavity that articulates with the upper arm bone. Here is Lucy's scapula. They are both aligned along this thing called the ventral bar, which is the load-bearing portion of the bone. And you can see that, and this is pretty much the way the bone sits in a human being, actually, that the human shoulder joint faces out to the side, whereas Lucy's shoulder joint faces up more towards the sky, as if she was used to keeping her arms elevated and reaching type activities. We quantified that as well. Humans had an angle of 145 degrees. The higher the number means the more towards the side the joint faces. The lower the number means more towards the sky. Apes all have lower numbers, and Lucy's scapula was just pretty much the same as a gorilla. Now, there have been some more recent finds which have had a bearing on our initial positions. This, in fact, is not of any afarensis specimen at all. This is from H. floresiensis, the little tiny hobbit-like creature from just 15 or so thousand years ago in Indonesia. And the reason I show this is because some people criticized our analysis of Lucy's scapula by saying, hell, well, they didn't say hell because that would be rude. They said, darn, all right? She was small, and all small humans are going to have glenoid cavities, have shoulder joints, which are more faced towards the sky. Well, you can't find that many humans as small as Lucy, but here is one that's as small as Lucy, or not human. This is a Homo specimen as small as Lucy, virtually exactly Lucy's size. And the glenoid cavity, the scapula of the Flores specimen, is even more sideways facing than the average human. So it has this has nothing whatsoever to do with size. And that's why I wanted to show this specimen and dispel that error on other people's part. This is here, the Dakika juvenile, which was published just last year by one of the folks in this, several of the folks in this audience, actually. And the describers said that this looked most to them like a gorilla. And their actual conclusions were, I'll give you that in a second. They did not measure the position of this glenoid cavity of this socket the same way we did, but they did measure it in their own fashion. And the glenoid fossa angle relative to the axillary border, that's a different part of the scapula, the important part is well within the range of apes and well outside that of humans. So Lucy was not a peculiar afarensis specimen. Here's the second afarensis specimen on which we can judge this same trait, and it's very similar to Lucy in this regard. They also found some of these bones from the first parts of the fingers of the Dakika juvenile, and those bones were described as long and curved, just like Lucy's are. And here is their conclusion. The scapular morphology, together with forelimb features, such as the long and curved manual phalanges of DK1, blah, 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 will raise new questions about the importance of arboreal behavior in A. afarensis. Now, one of these individuals, and I'm not going to identify him by name, all right, one of these individuals recently sent me an email pointing out as politely as he could that I had been wrong for 28 years, all right, since 1979. But I'm thinking now maybe that individual feels strongly both ways about it after I read this sentence. All right, we also looked at the hind limb. And our conclusions here, and this is the technical way of saying this, our conclusion was that she walked funny. Now, we never disputed Lucy was a biped when she was on the ground locomoting. All right, and I don't want anyone to think that we ever dispute that. We just thought that the manner of her two-legged walking was distinctly different than the manner of a modern human, and that if you saw her in the distance, you wouldn't say, oh, there's a little short person walking. You would say, boy, that person walks funny, all right? And that's what I mean by that. Now, again, 22 traits, not all independent, not all equally persuasive. I have to say, in my own opinion, the most persuasive trait is that the iliac blades, well, I'll have to show you. Well, if you don't know what iliac blades are, I don't know what to do. They're the parts where some of your buttock muscles arise. That the iliac blades ran side to side more than in a human, because in a human, these things run more front to back. All right, that's what iliac blades, more coronally oriented, means they run more side to side. We actually tried to get an estimate of this. If you look down onto the top of a pelvis of a human, here are the tops of the iliac blades. All right, here's what a chimpanzee looks like. It really goes entirely side to side. Humans have this big part which goes front to back. And Lucy looked to us, even more extreme than a chimpanzee. Well, we were certainly criticized, I think justifiably, because we never really reconstructed the pelvis of Lucy. We just put her bones together in a way that made sense to us. I won't explain why. But the fact is, shortly after we did this, Peter Schmidt reconstructed the entire skeleton of Lucy, and then he published his own picture of the orientation of these iliac blades, human, gorilla, orangutan, Lucy. So it's really no different than what we came up with. So I think there's hardly any doubt that her iliac blades were not oriented like they are in humans, and the important buttock muscles that arise from these, we thought, couldn't be acting the same way as they do in humans. This is how we think she walked. So this was an animation done by a Japanese television company that came to interview us. Now, in my defense, I'm going to say something I said in 2000 and will reiterate here today. I was never as certain about the nature of afarensis bipedalism as I was about its retained adaptations for movement in the trees. And in 2000, which was the last time I ever published on this, I still was not certain about it. And I have to say, if someone can demonstrate to me, or listen, to the rest of you don't have to demonstrate to me, that the orientation of these iliac blades is not telling us that she walked funny, then I would probably back off of that, because it's just there are other features about her that, in fact, would argue against our conclusion. But the orientation of those iliac blades is such an overpowering feature in my mind, knowing, because we've studied a lot of these buttock muscles in non-human primates, that I'm still would have to be proved that we were wrong in this regard before I would back off the statement. Well, we published our stuff. We were invited in 1983 to a locomotion conference held in Berkeley, where the people who had differing views on this were supposed to come to some resolution of this problem. Yeah. And here we have Bill and Randy talking to Tim. here Bill and I are talking to Al Burstein. I don't recognize the fellow in the background here. I don't think he played a very important role in the conference. But at any rate, we did become famous after that. All right? The newspaper reporters were calling us on the phone. They were visiting us. They, Newsday, all these people were publishing articles about our idea. And that, I guess I'd achieved what I had hoped for way back when. All right? Now, not everybody at the Berkeley conference did come to our way of thinking about this. To suggest that A. afarensis still employed a significant degree of pongid-like arboreal behavior, we never said pongid-like, but we'll let that ride, or that the stride pattern in this species included a primitive bent-hip, bent-kneed gait, has been recently suggested by a bunch of people, not only stands in contradiction to the available anatomical evidence from the hip, ankle, knee, and foot, but also stands in complete contradiction to the basic rudiments of neo-Darwinian theory. And that's one of the nicer things they said about us. All right. The debate over this has been ongoing since 1983, or even longer, actually. Carol Ward, Carol, you here in the audience? No. I want to say something nice about you. All right. 5 years ago, she wrote a very excellent review of the debate, pointing out some of the things that motivated each of us. With some, she said, I must say, that we were dead wrong on bipedalism, and she wasn't so sure if we were wrong or not on arboreality. But she has some suggestions about how these issues could be resolved. You may be prepared to talk about this at the workshop. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to preempt you because the issue has been resolved and there won't be anything for you to say about it anymore. And I'm going to tell you why it's been resolved. We live in the 21st century. Most of us live in the United States. Most of us. How is it that we learn truth? We learn it from television. Largely from the Fox News channel, but sometimes other channels as well tell us the truth. And in 2005, the History Channel broadcast a show, Ape to Man, in which they told us how Lucy moved. None of us were involved in this show, I'll tell you. But I will show you what they said.
Lucy is a tree dweller in a changing land. Her diet is mostly the fruit of trees like this fig. But one tree will not support her for long. And unlike her ancestors, she can no longer swing to the next tree. She must find another route. But Lucy does something no ape ever did. She stands up and walks on two legs. And it makes all the difference in the world.
You look like a pretty smart audience. One or two of you may not feel that the television broadcast resolves this to the level of certainty that I feel it resolves it to. So I am forced to bring out here a piece of evidence Bill knows about, but I've kept hidden for many, many years, waiting for the right moment. This is an actual letter that we received. It says, "Dear Professor Jungers and Associates," and it is signed respectfully and eternally, grateful for the monolith Obi Orion. Now, I'm not going to read you this whole letter, but there are certain points of it that I think are relevant. When I read Professor Donald Johansson's Lucy, the magnetic genetic thread evolved in a quantum leap through a reed. We all know that this is the standard method of time travel, quantum leaping through reeds. And Obi Orion did travel back in time to the site, to his place where afarensis lived. He saw from 300 to 350 yards a lot of activity as our ancient relatives scurried up and down the bark. She had elongated arms and that got cut off, very large hands, take my word for it. And she took 10 waddling steps toward me. So I have to tell you that until the people who disagree with us come up with their own time traveler, I consider this issue closed. Now, since it's closed and since I'm obviously never going to be asked to give another talk about this, I do have to think about what I want my legacy to be. And believe it or not, and I'm going to get serious here for a minute, honestly, I don't aspire to have a legacy that says, oh, they were right about this theory of arboreality, or they were right about that. That's not what I want it to be. We were accused of violating the basic rudiments of neo-Darwinian theory, and maybe some of you agree with that. We may or may not have done that, but I like to think personally that I was true to Darwin himself. And this is what I mean. Darwin said in his book, The Descent of Man, Selection in Relation to Sex, false facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often long endure. But false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, as everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. And when this is done, one path towards error is closed, and the road to truth is often at the same time open. I really hope that all of the facts that we provided on this topic are true. That's the legacy that I want people to remember me by, that he gave true information, even if his theories were crazy. Thanks very much.
All right, I would like to ask our panel members to come up on the stage for this afternoon. This is the right time for this, right? Yes, panel discussion. And take your places.
Is Fredrick here?
He was earlier. I just have to tell you all, you have a tough act to follow. Okay, I'm going to go on, whatever you're doing, okay? Okay, I'm ignoring you. Can we just start at that end and have everyone introduce themselves?
My name is Gary Schwartz. I'm a paleoanthropologist at the Institute of Human Origins based out of Arizona State University.
My name is Fredrick Manthi. I'm a postdoc with TBI and also a research scientist at the National Museum of Kenya, Nairobi.
I'm Bill Jungers. I'm in the Department of Anatomical Sciences, School of Medicine here at Stony Brook.
I'm Terry Harrison. I'm a professor of anthropology at New York University.
I'm Elizabeth Harmon. I'm professor of anthropology at Hunter College, part of the City University of New York system, and New York Consortium of Evolutionary Primatologists as well.
I'm Adam Gordon. I'm at the Center for the Advanced Study of Hominid Paleobiology at George Washington University.
I'm Frank Brown. I'm a geology professor at the University of Utah.
Kay Behrensmeyer. I'm a research curator at the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., Smithsonian Institution.
Well, welcome everyone. So I guess, does anyone want to start with their opinion of this afternoon's 4 entries into diversity in Australopithecus? Terry.
I'd like to volunteer Kay to start to talk about time in the geological record and what we can see and what we may not be able to see. She did a very nice job in her paper.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Frank, I guess. Well, spatial scale and temporal scale, I think, are critical in terms of how we think about them. As an example, if we have a sample of fossils from one of the Hadar submembers that Kay was talking about, that might span something like tens of thousands of years of taphonomic averaging, and maybe not averaging in its true sense, of what went on in the ecology. And as she said, you can have fluctuations of ecotones, and you can have dry periods, you can have wet periods, you can have a lot of things going on during that time span, and yet we tend to think of those samples as somehow snapshots that can be related to modern analogs. And thinking about Jack's talk just now, if there's any legacy that I hope to leave, it's that it will be the improvement, the refinement of thinking about what our samples really mean, both in terms of time and in terms of the processes that put the fossils in the ground, and gave us very interesting and very informative samples. But if we're going to do anything with them, we need to understand the biases, and we need particularly to understand what they mean in terms of time.
Thank you, Kay. Terry, do you want to say something now?
I was actually immediately struck by this morning's discussions and this afternoon's, that it kind of opens up a lot of questions that I think Richard Leakey emphasized in his opening introduction. And that is that we know a lot, I think, about what happened in human evolution. The morning session was about what really happened, and then to the more difficult questions of how and why this afternoon. And those types of questions are really very difficult, and I think that several of the speakers this afternoon really began to delve into understanding what happened in, why things happened in human evolution and how they happened. But those questions are really, really difficult, and I think that I think Kay and Matt and various other speakers this afternoon really highlighted the complexity of this. And if I can just sort of take one more minute just to highlight really that Kay talked about the reconstruction of paleoecology, Matt talked about how you reconstruct diets, and one of the things that happens there is that there's actually a bit of a mismatch, that we can reconstruct the really big paleoecologic picture of sites such as Hadar or Laetoli, and we can reconstruct to some extent the dietary behaviour of those hominids, but we don't actually know what parts of the environments particular hominids were exploiting. And that's really a very difficult question. We know what the ecology and habitats were like, but we don't really know what the hominids were doing within that other than their diets. And that's the key issue, I think, that needs to be resolved in the kind of with this type of research. And I think Kay and Matt and various other people are beginning to get there. What we're really trying to do is actually look at individual sites in great detail now. The work that Kay has done on Hadar, for example, the work that I'm currently doing at Laetoli in Tanzania. And what we're trying to do is really put these sites under a microscope, look in real detail at the paleoecology of the sites, and with that detailed picture assemble a much broader picture. So in other words, the old ideas in our textbooks of a broad sweeping change in Eastern Africa from woodlands to savanna has really gone now. We realise it's actually a very complex situation, a mosaic of different habitats, and what we really need to do now is put the hominids back into that bigger picture once we've assembled the small pieces. And so I was really struck today by the kind of the level of analysis that we've got available to us, the beginning of really beginning to grapple with this question about what hominids are actually doing, rather than this mismatch between the big paleoecologic picture and some aspects of their biology. So I think we're really beginning to get some insights now into how that's all beginning to fit together.
Adam.
I think there's also there's a mismatch, but in some ways it's also a complementary approach. And if we can get past the issues of scale or figure out how to deal with them, we have a potential where the habitat reconstruction can tell us what environments were available. And things like dietary reconstruction, locomotor reconstruction, these are potentially ways that we get at what portions of those habitats they were using. And this is really important because then we can start to understand, are the ways that they are moving around and the things they are eating, are they constrained by those habitats that are available, or are they using only a subset of those habitats? And this ties back into the community ecology as well. And if we go back to this morning's session, Charlie was talking about, we have this anagenetic change going from Anamensis through Afarensis, and there doesn't seem to be any major climatic shifts that are going on across the continent. But there may be more smaller local things that are affecting the community ecology, which are opening up new niches or closing off niches. And this is what's generating selection pressure that then drives adaptation in hominids and in other taxa as well. And we can only get at that once we figure out what habitats are available. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly was the dietary information that we're getting with Matt's work, for example, where you can look at dietary breadth or how narrow or wide things are, also give us some information about how susceptible particular taxa might be to resource stress. So for example, if it holds up that Afarensis does have a very narrow diet and it is relying on fruits regardless of where it is, then one might suspect then that Afarensis is going to be more susceptible to resource stress than things like Africanus that may be relying on more broad diets. So all of these tools are different ways of looking at the same thing, and they don't necessarily have to be mismatches, but rather can inform on each other very nicely if we can get all these people together like we are today to talk about this stuff.
I'm going to shift the focus just for a moment, and I'd like to note that all the correct facts in Jack's legacy come from me. Okay? Actually, I think Jack answered the question this morning, but I want to return to that again, and that was, is there only one way to be a biped? And because I think certainly everyone agrees it's one of the defining events in human evolution. And I think you can see things happening sort of in blocks. There are things that you really have to be a biped. So in a sense, yeah, there is only one way to be a biped as it relates to managing your center of balance. And so the first changes we see in the fossil record relate to that, sort of moving your center of gravity closer to the hip joint, having a lumbar lordosis, bringing your center of gravity back, having angled knees that bring your center of gravity and your point of contact in closer contact or in line with one another. So I think there are sort of fundamental biomechanical principles that dictate how bipeds must walk. But that's not the end of the process. I think that we can see from the fossil record that there's a lot of morphological change that takes place throughout the postcranial skeleton. I think that the Australopithecus model worked for a long time, possibly from the late Miocene to 2.5 million years ago. But there's a lot of change, there's reorganization of the postcranial skeleton after that. And I think one of the questions I hope we'll get to in the workshop is, what is the impetus for that reshaping of the skeleton that we start to see in Dmanisi and in the Neurocotomy boy? Those are the things. That transition, I think, is an interesting one.
To me, it's very interesting to really, some of the issues that are coming up, especially from this afternoon's presentations. It was very nice to hear from Matt about Afarensis and also Paranthropus boys here. For a long time, we've always kind of believed that, or learned that Paranthropus was more of specialist, and also that Afarensis we had today, that he was kind of more specialist based on Matt's studies. And I do hope that with more research, you should be able to get more information. And all this put together, I think, will make the story more clearer about the kind of diets, about the kind of environments in which these different species evolved. Meave also noted about, spoke about Canandropus plateaus having these different habitats or microhabitats, basically, which may have been at the disposal of this particular species. And also Australopithecus anamensis. And I want to comment on this particular species, largely based on my studies for my PhD, which showed that there were different habitats that would have been accessible, or that anamensis would have had access to. Based on the rodent studies that I did, the fauna from Kanapoi suggests a mosaic of an environment, as you mentioned in your presentation, because there are rodents that suggest a more arid and dry environment. There are also other rodent species that suggest a more wetter environment or more kind of woodland environment. So what this tells us is that these early hominids would have had access to a mosaic or different habitats, and I believe that they must have utilized these habitats for their own survival.
Just want to pick up on the theme of diversity, since that's what the symposium is about. certainly in listening to talks like Meaves and with some of the new fossils like Zarai's Tikika baby, we certainly know that there's a lot more diversity of actual species around, and that was, I think, when people thought about diversity years ago, that's what they thought about, how many kinds of early human ancestors were there. But what the talks this afternoon have really highlighted, for me in particular, is that in the past 10 years, our understanding of excuse me, the diversity in the biology and the sort of adaptive profile of how we view these early hominids. You mentioned the Paranthropus and how diet, we used to think, was very narrow, and that was possibly a reason for why that species went extinct. And now, as Matt has shown, that perhaps it's actually exactly the opposite. There were probably diversities of ways of being a bipedal hominid, that we need to think more in terms of how evolution tinkered with the basic design of early hominids rather than totally redesigned it to make something new. And I just think a lot of the people on the panel and some of the delegates are applying very clever, technologically savvy ways of addressing some of those questions.
I think there's one other thing that should be said about the effect of time. And is that, you can hear? And that, ooh, now you can hear. That is that there is a very strong precessional climatic signal in East Africa that we see in the marine records off of the East African coast, extending well back beyond 5 million years. And this is just about 20,000 years long. And it just beats back and forth like a pendulum, like a clock. You can see it in the amount of dust coming off the continent. You can see it in the isotopes. You can see it in a number of ways. And there is a very tantalizing record in the Jungers Formation in Ethiopia that makes it look as though floodplains were laid down every 20,000 years. And Meave alluded to this in her talk. And she said, well, suppose all the floodplains were laid down during wet periods, and then there was a time period where there was little sedimentation until the next floodplain was laid down. And if that's the case, then the soils that we're sampling would have sampled a different part of the climatic cycle than the animals that are being sampled. And it's very important for us to get this polarity correct. We're thinking if there really is one, and we'll be trying to do this in the Jungers over the next couple of years.
If I could add amen to that, but also there's the possibility that the most fossils actually accumulate in the transition from the dry to the wet, because the bones stay around longer on the surface under dry conditions. Then you get the onset of a wet period, and you get the flooding washing those bones into deposits. Some environments would do that, others might not, like fluvial systems that are reworking their floodplains all the time. But I think this is really a point for discussion over the next several days, because I think there's a lot more to it. Thanks to me for pointing that out, and Frank as well, that we can figure out.
Well, I'd like
I think
to,
we
if
can.
I may, go back to the picture of the lions in the trees. And I hope that my colleague Carol Ward will still speak to me after I say this, but I think if lions can be in trees, it's probably likely that Australopithecus inhabited trees at some time. But I think what I'm struck by the most when I listen to these talks during the day is that I'm someone who studies morphology, and I think it's very easy for people like me to look at these fossils and sort of forget the biological systems in which they are operating. And so the value of what we've talked about today is a really strong reminder that Australopithecus is exactly like those lions and is exactly going to be responsive to a variety of conditions, including what we're talking about with diet and how you access your resources and how you get away from predators, how you prey on animals if that's something that you're doing. And this kind of talk, this talk that we're having now and the talk that we'll have over the next several days will help us all really focus on these animals in an ecosystem as part of a mammalian community.
Okay. No, none of you have any, I don't know whether I'm talking. Can you hear me? Are there questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Yes, I have two questions based on the same topic. I'd like to know a time sequence for this transition from the arboreal to the bipedal. Are we talking about 500,000 years? Are we talking about 1,000,000 years? And I'd like to know whether you can definitely correlate that transition with the transition from the forest to the savanna, or the so-called savanna, and its different implications.
I'll have a shot at that. The last one I'd say no. I mean, it's pretty clear that you don't need a savanna to evolve a biped. Australopithecus is a biped in enclosed forests, presumably. Afarensis, for diversity of habitats that Kay talked about. So I think the second question is no. We moved a long way out of the savanna model for bipedal origins for a long time now. The other question is a little more difficult because the earliest fossils that we have that have been attributed to hominins, like Aurora and Sahelanthropus, that precede Australopithecus, are so fragmentary. I've done a recent analysis of the Auroran femur, and I got to tell you, it looks like an Australopithecine in all the defining features of the proximal femur. Leads me to believe that that kind of bipedalism has been around for at least 6 million years. How one infers, locomotion and posture from a skull alone, like Sahelanthropus, is a little trickier for me to contemplate. We still don't know what the impetus for bipedalism is. There's been some incredibly imaginative scenarios, and that's pretty much what they still are scenarios. I don't think we have a good explanation for this peculiar form of locomotion, but we know it's there early, and we know it is defining who we are ultimately.
And the other thing about that I think that's important is if you think about Australopithecus afarensis occupying multiple different kinds of habitats for a very long period of time, this is obviously a very successful strategy. So it's not really clear, and maybe never will be clear, why it occurred, but it was clearly very successful for these hominins.
And let me just add a footnote. I think your question was the transition from arboreality. Some of us believe that arboreality was part of the locomotor package for a very, very long time. So it wasn't, an either-or proposition. Some of us would see that the early Australopithecine bipedal package included an arboreal component.
Someone else? Yes. The white. Yeah.
I really have two questions. One is really a factual question. Just out of curiosity, I would like to know what the lifespan would have been for these groups. And the second question, I guess, comes from somebody that really doesn't know the field, but in light of Matt's talk on diet, is it possible that there was excrement preserved, and if so, was there any conclusions drawn from it?
Well, I can address the first part of your question, which is an excellent question, and one of the things that we haven't spoken about formally in a talk, which I hope we'll address this week, is something about how these early hominins grew up, what's called the life history, for lack of a better term. We all know that modern humans can live quite a long time. Of course, with modern medicine and interventions, we can extend that, but more indigenous populations live anywhere from 50 to mid-60s, in some cases even a little older than that. We know that modern chimps can live 40 to 40 years old. There are some chimps in the Gombe that have lived to a little bit older than that. So if we think about the earliest hominins, some of these early species of Australopithecines, some Auroran and Sahelanthropus, people have suggested that perhaps a more modern ape-like life history schedule is appropriate. They probably grew up in ways that were a little more similar to modern apes than to modern humans, but that by no means exactly like modern apes. So probably anywhere from 30 to 40 years, I would say, would be a good guesstimate of the lifespan of one of these earliest hominins. And of course, that was extended as we move to younger and younger ages as we evolved into the genus Homo and into modern Homo sapiens.
And the second part of the question was, could we look at diet through fecal matter, which if they're fossilized, we call them coprolites. And I don't know of any hominid coprolites that have been found, but we do have other animals that we look at. Does anybody know of hominid coprolites? No idea. Yes, right, yeah, early on. It's like, yeah, Matt says if we had them, that would be great. So, somebody else had a question back here, yeah.
Just to expand a little bit, when we're talking about stresses with diet, environment, I thought maybe if somebody could speak a little bit about pathological afflictions in the early hominin record and what evidence there is, and just talk a little bit more, also expanding on the question with age, just talk a little bit about pathology.
Yeah, there are ways of assessing stress, and when I say stress, I mean it different than sort of resource-based stress. Sort of a general metabolic physiological stress. And amazingly, those stresses are recorded in your teeth if those teeth are developing at that particular time. They can often leave a developmental marker, which we call a hypoplasia, which is a groove. And probably many of us here in the audience have these grooves running across our teeth. They can come from all sorts of, or result from all sorts of reasons. Weaning has been suggested to be stressful enough to incur these stressful markers. Birth is not only stressful on mothers, but also on the emerging fetus, and that can also leave a stress marker. And of course, illnesses, infections, periods of dietary insufficiencies can also stress individuals. And we do see, when you go look at the fossil teeth, in particular the front teeth, we do see lots of hypoplasias. And in fact, in just the same way that Matt showed, where he did those grooves down the height of a tooth in a way that got at some sort of episodic dietary signal, we see these episodic events, which in some cases are semi-annual or annual and may be related to resource crashes given the particular environment. So they're certainly there. I consider them more normal than pathological because almost all primates exhibit these, so, and modern humans as well.
Thank you. And then you had a question? Yeah. Okay.
Most of the discussion on characterization of the species has been based on gross anatomic structures. I was wondering, is it possible to look at the bone microarchitecture of these fossils? Specifically, I'm interested in whether you could look at the amount and distribution of cortical trabecular bone, since they're differentially responsive to different environmental stressors. So I would have thought bipedalism would change the composition or the distribution. And then the other is the second question is an easy one. What are the sources of calcium in these environments that would help mineralize these immature skeletons? And were these groups susceptible to fractures if there wasn't much in the environment?
I can speak to the first question a little bit. Were you curious about interspecies differences in sort of... Chris Ruff has collected most of the data relevant to that issue. Fred Grein has certainly added to it. It turns out that there's a lot of unpublished data on cross-sectional geometry of Australopithecus, but there's a good deal of variation. But I can tell you, for example, that Australopithecus afarensis, as evidenced by Lucy, had cortical bone that is completely within the modern range. It's not especially thick. You don't have little tiny medullary cavities. That appears to emerge a little later in time, and maybe in more than one lineage. What Chris has told me informally is that there's a lot of variation in cortical thickness in Australopithecus, but some of that variation does encompass modern human variation. But I don't think any of it has been used to sort of argue for interspecific differences yet. I don't think it's been applied in a taxonomic way.
wait for a microphone, okay? But please.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Turkana Basin Institute and Stony Brook University for putting this on. It's a marvelous event, and it's really every year. It's something to look forward to. My question has to do with bipedalism. I agree with a number of the remarks that were made about the primitive mosaic of many of these features. And I'm wondering, given the increasing diversity we're seeing in the fossil record and the longevity of some of these features that denote the presence of an erect biped, whether there's a possibility that may have evolved multiple times. And before I turn that to the panel, I do want to say something in defense of Jack Stern's thesis. For the students who are present here and are interested in functional anatomy and its evolutionary applications, it's probably one of the classic works ever written. And Jack, get rid of your television, it's warping your mind.
One person read it, Jack.
Okay, can we answer the bipedalism question, then we'll go back to the diet question? So
Is the question, is there's any evidence for multiple independent origins of bipedalism? I mean, I would say no. It's a problem when you study singularities and evolution, and I think this is a good example of it. I don't think there's any compelling evidence to make me want to argue, or anyone else in this room probably, that it's evolved more than once. Has it? Huh? Yes, it has been suggested that there is a Miocene ape in Italy that developed a peculiar bird-like bipedalism, but I don't think anyone takes that terribly seriously. So I would have to say probably no to that. Carol might want to comment on that.
Well, I think it'd be a difficult hypothesis to test in the first place. But we can certainly talk maybe, potentially, about locomotor diversity among Australopithecus species. That's a possibility. And that might be the way to get back to a question like that. But we try to make our questions simple, and to entertain the idea of multiple origins of bipedalism is attractive, but it's a little difficult to demonstrate, whereas locomotor diversity might be something we can talk about.
Just a comment. From the standpoint of the animal, the vertebrate kingdom, or the vertebrates in general, there are very few instances of bipedalism, actually, in the Cenozoic at least. It's a limited kind of sample of an adaptive mode, locomotor.
Okay, Matt, do you want to answer the calcium question?
Well, there's not a heck of a lot I can say about it, and I'll speak for some of the South African environments, though, because I've done a fair amount of trace element work on a lot of the vegetation there, and I can say there's an enormous amount of calcium available, very high levels in a lot of the vegetation. So I would be surprised from first principles if there were a real problem with calcium. Also, some of the people who have spent more time looking at the bones would probably be in a position to say whether or not there's evidence of anything there, but I certainly haven't seen anything.
Taphonomically also, I mean, we wouldn't see it because those fossils wouldn't be preserved, or those bones wouldn't be preserved.
Absolutely. Other questions? Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
The constant evolution that goes on with the human beings, is there any chance of looking at our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, to see whether or not they too are still evolving and in essence have become a wellspring of hominid evolution? I realize that that the populations are slowly dwindling thanks to our consumption of them and their dwindling habitats, but is there any evidence at all that might give us some idea that these creatures are still capable of evolving into a higher level animal?
Dr. Kimball, do you want to answer that? You're the species person.
Tell us about.
If I understand the question, it was: is there any evidence that chimpanzees are evolving towards a more human-like? No, there isn't. Which is not to say they're not evolving. Of course, they're evolving like we are. But chimpanzees have reached a particular adaptive plateau in the environments in which they live, and there's no evidence in the time frame that we can access that they're moving in any particular direction that would approximate human condition.
Thank you.
Yeah, recently, I just wanted to add, yeah, they do change, but on their own direction, of course. Recently, they found fossil gorilla, which is dated like to 10 million years, and it's put in a different genus and species because even though very close to gorillas, it's different. So yes, gorillas, chimpanzees also change like we change.
Thanks, Sarai. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Right here in the front, in the black.
I have two questions. My first question is, I know that our closest living relatives are chimps. I believe that it's 99.8 or really high percentage that we are genetically close to chimps. And I'm just, my first question is, where do hominids fall within that percentage? Do they fall within the last 0.2% of that genetic relationship? And my second question, as a museum informal educator, has to do with the attack on science in this in the United States, particularly nowadays. I have a colleague at the New York Hall of Science who had a debate recently with his school board about how they have programs after school to teach creation science in one of the Long Island schools, and just what we're reading in the newspaper and online and seeing in the news about the direction of science education nowadays and the whole ID creationist movement, in particular the New Creationist Museum. As a scientific community, what are your thoughts, approaches, and strategies towards getting your voices heard against this right-wing movement in the country?
I'll take a wild stab and say that the genetic similarity is greater between an Australopithecus and me than between a chimpanzee and me, but I don't know. I don't think I'd put a confidence interval on the exact percentage.
Are you sure you meant to say that? What did you just say?
I think she had asked, sort of, was there, as I understood the question, it was sort of what the difference was genetically between an Australopithecus and us relative to a chimp and us. Less difference.
Well, I'll take the second part because I'm very interested in this issue and I think it's important for all of us. And I do think this is a problem we all face, whether we want to recognize it or not. I have personal strategies that I use that I won't talk about here because it's probably not that interesting to people, but I do agree with the person earlier this morning who said high school science is the first line of defense, really. And I'm not sure that we're educating children today with enough knowledge about what science is and what it tries to do. And I think that that's fundamentally important. What is science? What does it try to do? What does it not try to do? And that level of understanding, I think, is really important to increase.
Can I just add to that? These questions that swirl around how do we sort of infuse the younger generation with a fascination of science. Kids are born scientists. The question they always ask is why? The difficulty that I think we as paleoanthropologists and paleoecologists and geologists face is that the actual subject matters that we deal with are usually not classes that kids encounter until they land on a university campus. In fact, certainly for me and perhaps for many of us, that's how we became interested in this. So I think if we could have more effective outreach to go into high schools, and even earlier than that, grade school. I mean, at the Institute of Human Origins, we have grade school kids come through all the time. They're fascinated to stand in front of a cast of Lucy and to hear from scientists who have fossils out in front of them, working, measuring things. And the teachers as well. And so I think we could all do a lot more on getting into those schools or getting forums where we could have grade school and middle school teachers come to events like this and to workshops where we could hand out little kits and explain, here's how you present the story of human origins to a younger audience.
Dave? Can
I follow up?
Sure.
I'm employed at the University of Albany and the New York State Museum
is also located in Albany, and they have a very fine group of evolutionary biologists there. And I think they do something that is very sensible, which is that they run a workshop specifically for high school science teachers, and about 50 or 60 people will come in, and they'll have presentations from people not just about human evolution, I'm the one that usually goes to that, for human evolution, but on all aspects of evolution. And it's, like Liz said, it's the high school science is the first line of defense, and we're not the warriors on that line of defense, right? But what we can do is, I think, we can work more closely with high school teachers who really are working with those students and really do inspire those students in very profound ways, to give them sort of the knowledge and background that they can transmit to their students. And so programs like that I've been involved with at the New York State Museum, which the museum runs, I think could be duplicated in other places, and I think that would be very effective.
We also might elect people who believe that science has something to tell us.
Do you have something to say about that too, Fredrick?
Sorry?
Do you have something to say about that too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Last week in Kenya, in the newspaper, we had an article by a professor from Nairobi University who discussed about the big role that us at the museum have to play in trying to reach out to as many Kenyans as possible. And he also talked about the role that the media has to play in our country, because what the media has been doing in the past is talking about a lot of politics and not science. So I think the media also has a really big role to play towards changing the situation in Kenya and I believe in lots of other countries about science, because the important thing is let the media and let the scientists tell the public about science, and it's upon the students in high schools and universities to make decisions about what they want to believe in. But as scientists and the media also, we all have a big role to play in trying to educate the public about the science or the research that we are doing in our labs, in the field and elsewhere.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hey, Terry?
A sort of slightly different tack on this. Yes, I agree with all my colleagues about the need for education in science and about human evolution. I think it's a wonderful medium, vehicle for discussing science. But I think one of the issues, and I think Richard Leakey raised this really very well in his opening remarks, is that it's a real battle out there, because it's not the open minds that are willing to learn about science, because that's really what many of us are talking about. It's actually the closed minds that the real battlefront exists. I teach a class, I'm fortunate I teach in New York City, and there aren't so many fundamentalists in New York City. But I think, when I ask my students at the beginning, I've had students come up to me at the beginning of my class on human evolution and say, look, I will learn all the material that you present to me, but I will not believe a word that you say. I say, fine, let's go from there. And then this year I asked them how many of them did not believe that humans had descended from an ape-like creature. The very beginning of the class. And out of 100 students, only 4 said no, 1 said he wasn't sure, and the rest said yes, they agreed on it. So I've not really got a cross-section of American society, because American society is actually much more heavily skewed to a much more closed-minded view of this, that no matter how much we educate the public, no matter how much, I hate to be a sort of a killjoy here, but the fact is it's really going to be a tough battle. I think Richard's great anecdote at the beginning about the bishop, I'm sure Richard could have really bombarded him with lots of evidence about human evolution, but I suspect the bishop went away unconcerned about the fact that this was actually reality. I suspect he stuck to his guns and really was closed-minded about it. That's the sector of society I think that we really have to work on, and that is really going to be a tough nut to crack.
Absolutely. Did you finally get a microphone?
Yeah, I've got a microphone.
Oh, okay.
I'm Bethany Escher. I'm chair of the Department of Anthropology at SUNY Potsdam, which is one of our small university campuses in far northern New York. And I face this in 2 directions. One, the human origins class that I teach, where I have students who've never actually had evolution because it's been avoided, which is as much of a problem as the ID problem, because people are afraid to talk about it in classrooms for fear of coming up with an argument. So I have students who've never even had it, and that faces that issue, the idea that they have to be exposed to be able to understand what's going on. But the other thing I face as chair of the department is when we're getting people tenured as faculty members in the department, the public outreach isn't valued in terms of publications and teaching. And so without that value, the things we do in the new faculty aren't going to reach out to other people to be able to talk and educate, because it's not going to work towards their tenure portfolios. So I have a hard time my own personal view is that they should be working as much as they can in the community, but I also can't endanger their tenure by telling them to do that rather than other things with their time. So I think those are some of the systemic things we need to change.
Okay, sir?
I'm glad there are so many people here from the state and city universities of New York, because one of the things that occurs to me is that the ability of children to learn about evolution, human or otherwise, depends heavily on the comfort that their teachers have with this subject. So I'm wondering to what extent evolution, human and otherwise, is a subject that is a required component of science teachers in the state of New York, and if not, what can this world-class university do to perhaps introduce that to the curriculum, not of students, but of teachers?
I'm not actually sure that was a question that we can necessarily answer here. You want to answer it? You have a different question? Okay, I'm going to come over. No, you first and then you, okay?
Just very briefly. I mean, education is one track, and we always go back to education, but I think people have suggested that part of the problem is in a much wider society and community, and we have a kind of deference to religion, and we even in using the word creation science, we give it implied approval, even when we don't mean to do so, by even accepting the language with which they express it. And I'm just wondering how much we ought to be more on the offensive with respect to denigrating, rather than treating with respect, and how much that is a problem of community organizing and of really confronting these issues directly and head on. I mean, I just read so much of the scientists who, even when they're addressing these issues, sort of always are so deferential to the religion, the religious tradition, to these other people, and not wanting to confront that. And I don't know whether it means, as a much more serious battle, we need to really confront it more directly and more aggressively.
Yes, very good. Yeah. Yes.
One suggestion that we have in the clinical research area is there's been a complaint that it takes a long time for research findings to go from the laboratory to clinical practice. And so in response to that, what we have heard from the NIH is that we need to include a dissemination plan in our grant proposals. And at Yale, we have a new program for clinical research, and all the pilot awards that we give out have to have a plan for dissemination of the research results by either the investigator or the research staff, and that this is an important component for who gets funding, as well as we're trying, not successful yet, but this should also be an important component of the promotions process, so that we're trying to build in dissemination of research findings into the whole process, re-engineering the process.
Thank you. Time for one more comment or question. Yes, you in the back. Oh, okay, two. You go last. Sorry, I didn't see you.
We've looked at a number of adaptive strategies that is driving evolution, but I haven't heard anyone discuss punctuated equilibrium. Could somebody address that?
Okay.
I could. I mean, punctuated equilibrium is actually in paleobiology not used that much in terms. It's sort of a given that there are periods, long periods of little change, and then episodes of major change, but somehow that terminology has sort of dwindled away as we understand that the periods of major change seem to be often environmentally driven. And so there are more efforts to put it into an environmental and climatic context for the periods of change. And the periods of stasis also are very interesting. It's as if, now we've moved beyond a label for a pattern, and we're delving into the processes within that pattern. So that definitely applies to the hominid record that we're talking about. There are periods such as afarensis that are there's very little change for hundreds of thousands of years. And then we have an unconformity where there's no record. We don't know if that represents a real punctuation or kind of a fake one, that is, that we've lost our record, but it was going on, something else was going on. So it's just a fundamental viewpoint on a reality of the fossil record that we're investigating all the time.
Thanks. And, sir?
Hi. The overpopulation of a particular species is leading to climate change as well as mass extinction. The question I have is doing with evolution in general. What are we going to see happen? What do you people think we're going to see happen? Are we going to see an influx in evolution? Are we going to see new species arise? Are we going to, what do you in store for what the planet's going through right now?
Mass extinction, I think, is what we're looking at it. And that's sort of a joke, but sort of not. I mean, we're definitely looking at a period where we have major climate change going on, probably anthropogenic in cause, and that's going to undoubtedly have impact. There have been studies that looked at ranges of various insects and animals in the British Isles, and all their ranges are shifting north because it's getting warmer. Well, the British Isles only extend so far north, so you're going to lose some of those after a while. So you'll definitely see extinction events. You may see new niches opening up. You may not. I mean, it's a good question, but evolution is ongoing, and we're generating some serious selection pressures out there. So things are going to change.
Anybody else? Yes, the situation is pretty dim as far as climatic change and what will happen. I think Richard said this morning will be like if we have 230 years left. And people think, oh, well, that's not really true. Yeah, it is. So on that good note, I'd like to invite you all. First of all, thank you for coming. And we have a speaker's reception.